Something strange happens when astronauts reach the end of their lives. The rehearsed lines fade, the polished answers fall away. And what's left is the truth they were never supposed to say out loud. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14, astronaut, moonwalker, and a national hero, spent decades speaking in careful hints. But near the end, everything about him changed. His tone, his patience, even the way he looked into a camera. It was as if he finally stopped worrying about how his words might land and started worrying about something else entirely. Now, with modern satellites revealing anomalies that match the photos Mitchell hinted at, and scientists quietly admitting the moon isn't the simple rock we were all taught it was, the question he kept trying to raise is louder than ever. What did he know that we weren't meant to hear? The story of Edgar Mitchell starts in the cockpit of military jets, where mistakes cost lives and pressure never let up. He flew for the US Navy at a time when tension in the world was high, and every mission demanded calm nerves. His commanders trusted him because he never lost focus, no matter how rough the situation looked. That reputation followed him everywhere. Steady hands, sharp mind, and no fear of learning something new if the mission demanded it. After the Navy, he didn't slow down. He chased degrees: aeronautics, astronautics, engineering. He stacked them like steps towards something bigger. By the time NASA even looked at him, he was the kind of candidate who could understand the science behind a rocket, fly the machine, and analyze the mission after landing. That combination was rare, and NASA didn't waste time when they saw it. And that part of the story becomes even more interesting once you realize NASA chose him at a moment when the entire space program was on the edge of collapse. By 1970, NASA's confidence had been shaken. Apollo 13 nearly ended in tragedy, and the public's excitement around the moon had faded. Politicians were questioning the money, critics were questioning the purpose, and inside NASA the fear was simple. One more disaster could shut the entire program down. That's when Mitchell's name moved to the top of the list. NASA needed people who were unshakable, people who wouldn't freeze under pressure, wouldn't panic if something went wrong, and wouldn't create drama for the cameras. Mitchell fit the mold perfectly. He was calm, mathematically sharp, and trusted by every team he worked with. If Apollo 14 had any chance of restoring faith in NASA, it needed someone like him in the lunar module. His role wasn't just to help land on the moon. He was part of what insiders later called the stabilization crew. These were astronauts NASA relied on to pull the program back from the brink, professionals who would execute the mission with precision so that the public, the government, and the world would believe again. Inside NASA, Mitchell built a quiet reputation. He wasn't the loudest in the room. He wasn't the type to chase headlines or argue for personal credit. His strength came from discipline. When he trained harder than the schedule demanded. When he studied, he went deeper than the mission required. He also had a habit that puzzled some of his colleagues. After every major mission event, he would analyze it endlessly. Not to complain, but to understand what really happened beneath the surface. While others moved on, Mitchell kept pulling threads to see where they led. That tendency to dig deeper made him a brilliant pilot. But it also made him curious in ways NASA didn't always like. Because when a man who thinks this way encounters something unusual, he doesn't let it fade into the background. He tries to make sense of it. And that trait is exactly what shaped the direction of his life after Apollo 14. Once Apollo 14 was over and the mission was considered a success, Mitchell could have stayed inside NASA's comfort zone, teaching, consulting, or working in engineering. Instead, he stepped into territory the government didn't like to talk about. He started asking deeper questions about consciousness, human perception, and the unexplained. Not from a mystical angle, but from a scientific one. He wanted to know how human awareness worked, how the mind interacted with the world, and what hidden layers reality might contain. That curiosity led him to form the Institute of Noetic Sciences, a research organization dedicated to studying human consciousness and its potential. This shift didn't come from fantasy. It came from years of classified briefings, personal observations, and conversations with insiders who knew more than they could ever say publicly. Mitchell didn't wake up one day and decide aliens were real. He pieced it together over decades. And to understand why his later claims mattered so much, you need to know what NASA already suspected about the moon long before Mitchell ever set foot on it. Lunar mission background. Decades before Apollo 14, strange reports circulated inside NASA and the US Air Force. Scientists studying the moon noticed brief flashes, moving glows, and areas that brightened and dimmed for reasons no one could explain. They called these events lunar transient phenomena. And although some were rare, they happened often enough to raise eyebrows. Air Force analysts also picked up unusual light patterns on the lunar surface. They appeared in specific areas, lasting seconds or minutes, and then vanished. Naturally, the public never heard about any of this. NASA wanted the moon to appear predictable, not mysterious. Behind closed doors, things got even stranger. Declassified military documents from the 1950s hinted at geometric shadows on the moon's far side, the side Earth never sees. These shapes didn't match natural formations. Some looked too straight, too clean, too aligned to be random. Scientists couldn't prove anything, but intelligence officers didn't dismiss the reports either. All of this built a quiet sense of curiosity and concern. After Apollo 13's near disaster, the whole world doubted NASA. Support dropped. Funding tightened. The White House considered shutting down future missions. Apollo 14 became the program's last chance to prove the moon project still mattered and wasn't a reckless gamble. But there was another layer the public didn't see. Apollo 14 landed in the Fra Mauro region, a site chosen partly for scientific reasons and partly because of unusual readings detected from orbit. Some analysts believed this region might hold clues about the moon's deeper structure. Others wondered if it might reveal why certain transient lights appeared around nearby craters. The mission needed to regain public trust, but it also had to quietly gather reconnaissance. NASA didn't tell the astronauts everything, but they gave them subtle instructions: observe closely, photograph everything unusual, and document anything that didn't fit the geological expectations. Mitchell, because of his analytical mind, was the perfect person for this type of subtle intelligence gathering. He could follow orders without drawing attention, and he could spot details others might overlook. And NASA wasn't the only agency watching closely. The intelligence community had its own reasons to focus on this mission. From the earliest days of the space race, the CIA kept a close eye on NASA, not to interfere, but to ensure national interests were protected. They had their own satellites, Corona, Keyhole, and others that captured high-resolution images of the moon far earlier than the public realized. Those satellite images revealed oddities like long, straight shadows, reflective surfaces, and shapes that didn't look natural. Nothing conclusive, but enough to make intelligence analysts curious. That curiosity turned into interest when mission planning selected Fra Mauro for Apollo 14. CIA advisors quietly flagged the area because some of the anomalies seemed to originate near it. Combined with earlier Air Force reports, the location became more than a scientific site. It became a strategic target. Mitchell never bragged about classified briefings, but insiders knew he attended several before Apollo 14 launched. The topics of those briefings remain sealed, but their impact shows in the questions he asked later in life. Because he was sent to observe, record, and confirm whether the moon held secrets that had been kept quiet since the early years of space exploration. And those secrets become even harder to ignore once you start looking at the mission itself, especially the parts NASA never talks about. Official Apollo 14 mission. When NASA announced Apollo 14, the goals sounded clean and scientific. Fra Mauro was the destination, a place the agency believed held clues about the moon's early history. Scientists wanted to study the highlands, hunt for rocks, older than anything recovered before, and place instruments that could shake loose answers about how the moon formed. One of those instruments was the seismic experiment, a tool designed to read the moon's internal behavior. By dropping equipment on the surface and setting off small impacts, NASA hoped to understand the layers below the soil. The astronauts trained hard to carry out those tasks with precision. Every movement was rehearsed, every sample collection practiced, and every step on the lunar surface mapped. The mission had to be smooth, controlled, and predictable to restore public confidence. What the world saw was a focused geological expedition, a straightforward operation that stuck to its scientific goals. But behind that simplicity, there were questions. Because Fra Mauro wasn't chosen only for its age, it was chosen because several earlier observations didn't line up with the moon's quiet reputation. Long before Apollo 14 touched down, satellite images from earlier reconnaissance platforms revealed odd shadows across parts of the lunar surface. Some looked too straight, too aligned with each other, almost like the edges of artificial structures. Analysts studying those images didn't agree on what they were seeing, but they agreed the shapes weren't typical of natural lunar formations. So when Apollo 14's landing site was finalized, several intelligence groups pushed NASA to treat this mission as more than science. One of the quiet objectives was to get closer looks at the areas where those geometric shadows appeared. The crew wasn't told they were searching for anything artificial, but they were instructed to photograph specific coordinates. These coordinates had no geological significance. They had strategic significance. Another hidden priority involved reflectivity anomalies detected near nearby craters. Some surfaces bounced light in ways that didn't match lunar rock. That contrast forced intelligence agencies to wonder if there were metallic materials or something else entirely. Apollo 14 carried cameras capable of capturing details far better than anything in orbit. Then there was the unusual seismic data from earlier missions. Certain readings hinted at movement patterns that seemed inconsistent with the moon's natural vibrations. No one publicly acknowledged these readings, but inside NASA, the data bothered analysts. And to carry out a mission with layers of hidden goals, NASA needed a crew dynamic that could handle discomfort, tension, and the unknown. The Apollo 14 crew had a fascinating balance. Alan Shepard, the mission commander, had a reputation for discipline that bordered on harsh. He liked control, he liked order, and he expected everyone around him to follow the same rulebook. That approach worked well in most missions, especially when precision mattered. Then there was Edgar Mitchell, who you already know by now. And that's why, when unusual gaps appeared in the mission records, some later wondered whether he had seen something he wasn't meant to discuss openly. The public version of the Apollo 14 mission timeline looks straightforward. But when you compare it to the internal logs, small discrepancies appear. They aren't dramatic enough to alarm someone casually reading the data, but they catch the eye of anyone who knows how tightly NASA normally documents every second of a mission. Some transmissions that should have been clean instead contain long stretches of static. These aren't the kind of glitches caused by a temporary radio issue. They're too precise, too selective. Almost like sections were masked or muted before the audio was released. Engineers later said these moments were technical faults, but the consistency raises questions. Timecodes in the EVA logs show small mismatches. A few minutes disappear here, a few seconds vanish there. NASA claimed these were formatting errors during transcription, but when astronauts describe their steps on the surface, their narration sometimes doesn't match the official timestamps. Even the EVA videos show odd edits. Short jumps, missing frames, and abrupt transitions appear in places where nothing dangerous or private was happening. If these cuts protected sensitive technology, NASA would have said so. Instead, the edits remain unexplained. When Mitchell was asked about these gaps years later, he didn't accuse NASA directly. But he didn't defend them either. He simply said the missing pieces weren't what people assumed. Mitchell stayed silent for decades after Apollo 14. Then, in the 1990s, he started opening up but gently. In several radio interviews, he didn't accuse NASA of hiding anything specific about the moon. Instead, he spoke broadly about the government keeping secrets related to extraterrestrial activity. He said humanity wasn't alone, and that advanced beings had been observing Earth long before the space age. The interviews didn't go viral. They didn't trigger outrage or panic. They were treated like passing comments from a retired astronaut exploring philosophical ideas. But people who listened closely noticed something strange. Mitchell wasn't guessing. His tone carried certainty. He spoke as someone who wasn't speculating but confirming. He explained the government had decades of contact-related evidence locked away. He claimed these beings weren't hostile, but they were keeping watch. And each time he spoke, he pushed the boundary a little further. What made the interview stand out was his confidence. Years later, Mitchell shifted from talking about distant oversight to focusing directly on the moon. He stated that the moon wasn't the lifeless place NASA described for decades. He referred to structures, activity, and a presence that NASA chose not to acknowledge publicly. The way he spoke about it changed too. During the 2000s, there was a seriousness in his tone that wasn't present before. It sounded like someone who felt responsible for sharing information before it was too late. As his health declined, the urgency behind his interviews increased. He didn't name specific locations or describe the structures in detail, but he gave enough hints to suggest the moon held more than rock and dust. He also pushed the idea that astronauts weren't told everything about the locations they were exploring. His wording made it clear he believed NASA filtered what the crews were allowed to know and only disclosed the bare minimum necessary to complete a mission. He never accused individual scientists, but he suggested the system of secrecy went deeper than most people realized. Mitchell didn't hesitate when asked whether all Apollo footage was released. His answer was simple. No, he said NASA filtered, edited, and controlled what reached the public. Some footage, according to him, was held back because it contained moments NASA didn't want people overanalyzing. He hinted at internal debates about whether astronauts should even be exposed to certain parts of the lunar surface. According to him, NASA questioned what the crew might see and what they should avoid looking at for too long. This wasn't officially documented, but Mitchell's comments painted a picture of an agency walking a thin line between exploration and information management. He didn't claim every missing frame was hiding aliens. He said some footage was cut because it showed anomalies NASA couldn't explain. Instead of fueling confusion or panic, they simply removed the moments that might start a storm of questions. In his last years, Mitchell didn't hold back anymore. His interviews became more direct. He spoke about non-human intelligence monitoring nuclear facilities on Earth, suggesting these beings wanted to prevent humanity from destroying itself. He connected this oversight with lunar missions, implying the same watchers kept an eye on what the Apollo astronauts did on the moon. Then he said the line that captured attention around the world: "There is more on the moon than anyone has been allowed to see." And the question that naturally follows is, what exactly did he think NASA was hiding, and why would the agency hide it in the first place? Anomalies. The deeper you go into the Apollo 14 mission files, the more you start noticing little details that don't line up with the clean, polished version NASA presents. And the strange thing is, these aren't rumors from random UFO blogs. These are small cracks inside NASA's own documentation, the kind of cracks that only become obvious when you look at the transcripts, the EVAs, and the internal memos side by side. Edgar Mitchell knew those cracks better than anyone, and what he hinted at later in life starts to make a lot more sense when you revisit the mission with fresh eyes. During EVA-2, the official goal was simple: reach Cone Crater and gather older lunar material. NASA expected it to be a tough hike, but nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the audio logs capture a pattern that stands out. Mitchell stops talking. Shepard keeps encouraging him to keep moving. Then both of them fall into stretches of long silence. NASA labels these as breaks, almost like they were catching their breath. But Mitchell later told interviewers that they didn't struggle only because of the slope. He never explained what he meant. He just said there were unexpected conditions. When you talk to geologists, they say nothing in the Fra Mauro region should have behaved irregularly. The surface is rough, but predictable. Yet the two astronauts kept veering off the planned route as if something drew their attention away from the target. At one point, Mitchell stops for nearly 30 seconds. NASA later said he was resting. But the man who walked on the moon barely admitted to being tired later in life. Then there's a 2-minute gap in Apollo 14's communications that doesn't behave like a technical glitch. Every other transmission problem in mission history came with static or distortion. This one didn't. It was clean silence, not a single hint of interference. NASA blamed equipment interference, but you don't get interference that removes both static and signal. You either lose connection entirely or you get noisy fragments. This recording offers neither. When parts of Air Force tracking logs were declassified decades later, analysts flagged that 2-minute silence as unusual, which is rare when agencies normally defend NASA. It shows others noticed the gap long before Mitchell started talking publicly. What makes the silence even stranger is what happens right after it ends. Shepard speaks first, and his tone is sharper than before, almost like he's snapping himself back into mission mode. Mitchell follows more slowly, sounding distracted, as if his mind isn't on the task anymore. People who analyse high-pressure team communication say this shift indicates the astronauts just processed something unexpected. It doesn't prove anything alien, but it suggests something happened they didn't want to say over open channels. In the middle of the EVA, Shepard suddenly reports seeing a bright reflection in the distance. NASA's explanation was simple: sunlight bouncing off a rock. Anyone who's seen moon photos knows the surface can reflect harshly, but this particular reflection didn't match the expected angle based on where the sun was. When modern image analysts revisited the EVA timeline, they noticed the sun's position should have made a bolder reflection weaker, not sharply bright. NASA tried to bury the comment by leaving it without follow-up in the public transcripts. They didn't ask Shepard to describe the shape. They didn't ask where exactly it came from. They just moved on. That wouldn't be unusual, unless you compare it with other missions. When Apollo astronauts reported flashes, glints or anything out of the ordinary, Mission Control always asked for extra detail. Here, nothing. Just silence and a quick topic change. Mitchell never contradicted NASA publicly about the reflection, but he also never backed their explanation. And that's telling because Mitchell spent the final decade of his life insisting the moon wasn't the empty rock the public was taught to believe it was. When asked about lights on the moon, he always said, "There are things up there we didn't expect." He didn't specify this reflection, but the timing fits too perfectly to ignore. One of Apollo 14's main tasks was placing seismic charges to test how the lunar surface reacts. When they detonated those charges, the seismometers should have given patterns typical for a solid celestial body. Instead, the readings behaved in ways no one fully understood. Some showed reverberations that lasted far longer than expected. Others suggested the ground under certain sections was hollow or chamber-like. NASA later admitted the moon rang like a bell during earlier missions, but Apollo 14's data added new layers. The reverberations didn't behave the same across all areas, meaning some parts of the moon seemed far less dense than others. Several engineers proposed natural geological explanations, but none of them aligned cleanly with the readings from Fra Mauro, where Mitchell worked. Years later, Mitchell said the moon had strange internal characteristics. He avoided technical terms, but the phrasing stuck with researchers studying anomalies. He never said the moon was artificial. He just said its internal structure wasn't what NASA initially thought. Coming from a man who took the data himself, it's hard to dismiss. What other astronauts said? Mitchell's comments didn't come from nowhere. Across the Apollo era, several astronauts dropped small, sometimes cryptic statements that echoed the same themes: unexplained structures, strange sightings, and a quiet belief that humanity wasn't exploring space alone. These weren't fringe thinkers. These were men trusted with billion-dollar missions, and many of their comments line up with what Mitchell hinted about the moon. Buzz Aldrin is one of the most respected figures in space history, and even he made remarks people still quote today. He once talked about a monolith-like shape on Phobos, the small moon of Mars. When asked about extraterrestrial life, he didn't hesitate. He said humans weren't alone and never had been. People often treat Aldrin's Phobos comment like an isolated quirk, but when you pair it with Mitchell's statements, a theme appears. Both men suggested that unexplained structures aren't limited to Earth's backyard. Aldrin took a cautious approach, keeping most of his comments tied to Mars. Mitchell, near the end of his life, expanded the scope. And while they talked about different places, the underlying message was identical: space isn't empty. But Aldrin wasn't the only astronaut hinting at hidden truths. One of NASA's earliest space heroes had stories even Mitchell respected. Gordon Cooper was one of the original Mercury 7. His reputation was built on precision, honesty, and calm under pressure. That's why his UFO encounters still carry weight. Before he even joined NASA, Cooper witnessed what he described as a disc-shaped craft landing during his Air Force service. He reported it through official channels, and the incident vanished into classified files. When he joined the Astronaut Corps, he made several comments about government secrecy surrounding non-human technology. He wasn't reckless, but he was clear. He said there were things the public wasn't being told, and he believed Earth had been visited long before the space age began. Mitchell later said he respected Cooper's openness, even though most astronauts stayed quiet. Cooper's stories created a foundation that made Mitchell's later comments feel less isolated. Cooper spoke about the Air Force hiding evidence. Mitchell spoke about NASA editing lunar evidence. They came from different angles, but they were describing the same wall of secrecy. Story Musgrave flew on 6 space shuttle missions, and was known for his engineering expertise. He rarely talked about anything speculative. That's why his unexpected remark about seeing something organic-looking during a mission caught attention. He didn't claim it was alien, but the phrasing suggested he saw movement or shape that didn't behave like equipment or natural particles. Some people brushed it off as a joke, but others saw it as another small piece of a bigger pattern. Astronauts occasionally encountered things they couldn't explain. When people talk about Edgar Mitchell's claims, the first question that always comes up is simple. Why would NASA hide anything at all? And for most people, that's where the conversation ends. They think NASA had no reason to keep secrets. The moon landings were a triumph. The whole world watched. What could possibly be worth hiding? But when you go back to the world of the 1960s and early 1970s, the answer becomes clearer. It was performing under the pressure of the Cold War, when every achievement was tied directly to national power. The US didn't just want to go to the moon for exploration, it wanted to go there first, because whoever reached higher ground looked stronger. If the government even suspected that something non-human had technology beyond anything on Earth, it wouldn't want that information public. Officials feared that admitting alien contact would give the Soviet Union an opening. If aliens existed, the US might look vulnerable. And in the Cold War mindset, vulnerability was unacceptable. Mitchell often mentioned this atmosphere in interviews. He said the real threat was how nations would react to alien presence. Back then, even small scientific details were classified if there was a chance it could be misunderstood by rival countries. So the idea of hiding something as big as extraterrestrial structures wasn't a stretch. It fit the political world Mitchell was a part of. And then there was religion. During the Apollo era, religion shaped daily life more than it does today. Many Americans had faith tightly woven into their worldview. Anything challenging humanity's place in the universe could trigger confusion, fear, or even rejection. Government advisors worried that public belief systems might crumble if they suddenly announced alien presence. Mitchell said he understood why NASA hesitated. Leaders didn't want riots, panic, or institutional collapse. He often explained that revealing extraterrestrial life was about managing the psychological shock that would come with it. People had a stable picture of the world. Aliens didn't fit into that picture, and authorities feared the reaction to that disruption more than they feared aliens themselves. Even decades later, Mitchell explained that governments like stability. They avoid anything that could shake the foundation of society. And that's the same logic NASA used to keep their public story clean and controlled. If there was even a small chance that extraterrestrial visitors had technology far superior to anything on Earth, every nation would want access to it first. That alone would be reason enough to keep discoveries hidden. Mitchell hinted that military agencies were far more involved in space secrecy than NASA was. NASA handled the science, but the deeper implications were handled elsewhere. Mitchell once said governments feared what other nations might do if they learned someone else had access to non-human technology. The logic was simple. If you control advanced technology, you control the future. And no country wanted to be second in line. This mindset explains why some Apollo images were withheld and why certain pieces of data were scrubbed. It wasn't about misleading the public, it was about making sure no other nation could jump ahead. If the moon held signs of something artificial, that discovery could have shifted global power instantly. And in the Cold War, even the possibility of that was enough reason to classify everything. NASA needed to keep the moon program spotless. Billions of dollars were being spent, and the agency had to justify every mission. If the public got even a hint that astronauts encountered something unexplainable, skepticism would rise. Some people would panic. Others would accuse NASA of hiding the truth, and the ones controlling funding would start asking uncomfortable questions. So NASA became extremely careful about what it showed. They removed anything that looked unclear or confusing. They didn't want people staring at a strange shadow in a photo and declaring it evidence. Mitchell said NASA wasn't trying to mislead people, it was trying to keep the program alive. And during those years, funding depended heavily on public trust. But while NASA focused on image and politics, Mitchell cared about something completely different. He spent his final years talking about motives. Edgar Mitchell never described aliens as chaotic or aggressive. He always spoke with a tone of reassurance, almost like he wanted people to understand that extraterrestrials weren't here to cause harm. He talked about observation, caution, and warnings. Mitchell often returned to one idea: extraterrestrials are monitoring nuclear activity. He said this in interviews repeatedly, sometimes with more edge than NASA would have liked. He claimed the aliens knew humanity reached a dangerous stage when nuclear weapons entered the picture. He talked about conversations with people who worked at nuclear facilities and saw strange objects appearing during weapon tests. He also mentioned military officers who told him about UFOs hovering over missile sites. Mitchell connected these incidents with a larger pattern. Mitchell always described extraterrestrials as passive observers. He said they rarely made themselves known unless they needed to. He never portrayed them as enemies. Instead, he emphasized how they avoided confrontation. He believed they allowed humans to make mistakes but stepped in subtly when the outcome could be catastrophic. This idea matched stories from other astronauts and Air Force personnel. Many of them described UFOs disabling missiles but never destroying anything. Mitchell believed these actions weren't attacks, they were warnings. He said aliens didn't want conflict. They simply didn't want nuclear weapons spreading beyond Earth. The deeper you go into leaked government files, the harder it becomes to pretend all of this is just coincidence or misinterpretation. People usually think leaked UFO documents look like something out of a movie, dramatic, bold, coded. But the real ones, they're quiet, they're messy, they're filled with redacted black bars. They feel like paperwork that wasn't meant to be looked at twice. Let's start with the most explosive set of documents ever connected to UFO secrecy: the majestic 12 papers. People still argue about whether they're genuine disinformation or a mix of both. But what matters for this documentary is that certain pieces inside them line up almost too perfectly with what Mitchell said privately, long before the internet ever discovered these leaks. The papers describe a small group of officials created in the late 1940s to handle extraterrestrial material, crashes, technology, and contact attempts. Most of the information sounds unbelievable at first glance. Claims of retrieved craft, claims of recovered bodies, claims of technology that didn't belong to any country. But here's the part that connects straight to Mitchell. The documents say the moon was listed as an ideal perimeter for early-stage observation. That phrasing stands out because Mitchell used nearly identical wording decades later, calling the moon a platform where extraterrestrials could observe Earth without interference. Another detail inside the papers mentions the importance of seismic readings and underground void structures on the moon. Mitchell became obsessed with lunar seismic anomalies after Apollo 14. He spent years studying them. He even said Earth's natural satellite felt designed for watching. And there's another strange note. The papers list multiple intelligence agencies involved, not just the CIA or the Air Force, but groups whose names most people have never heard. Mitchell later said extraterrestrial information wasn't held by NASA. The timing, the language, the secrecy, it all lines up in ways that make you wonder how much of this was fabricated and how much slipped out that wasn't supposed to. And that's where the NSA's FOIA releases begin to add a whole other layer. When the NSA finally released a batch of UFO-related files after heavy FOIA pressure, the tone of the documents was nothing like pop culture alien visitor stories. They were technical, clinical, and focused on something very specific: signals, not sightings. One file stood out, a review of intercepted transmissions labelled unusual or non-terrestrial. None of the documents ever used the word alien, but they danced close enough to it that officials couldn't pretend the topic didn't exist. Engineers wrote about patterns that didn't match natural cosmic noise. Analysts highlighted bursts that repeated too cleanly to be random. Mitchell later said extraterrestrials were keenly aware of humanity's technological evolution. If that's true, then monitoring radio, radar, and nuclear communication makes perfect sense. There's also an internal training document that teaches analysts how to decode unknown language systems. It's written like a university course, except the examples don't match any known human tongue. Some researchers think it was just an exercise. Others think it references something we were intercepting but didn't understand. The strangest part comes from the NSA's reaction to public curiosity. When reporters asked about the documents, spokespersons downplayed everything. They said the files weren't important, that they were outdated, that people were exaggerating. Yet hundreds of pages were heavily redacted. If the information didn't matter, Why cover most of it with thick black ink? And the pattern continues when you look at the Defense Intelligence Agency's papers, the ones that reference the type of craft Mitchell hinted at without ever naming directly. When the DIA began releasing UFO-related material, it quickly became clear these documents had a very different tone. They weren't about signals or intercepts. They were about physics, theoretical propulsion, materials that reacted strangely to energy, reports of craft that seemed to defy inertia. One report openly discusses non-human craft capabilities. That's the exact phrase investigators focused on because it avoids the word alien while admitting the technology wasn't ours. Mitchell claimed extraterrestrial technology operated on principles that didn't resemble our own. He said humans were scratching the surface while someone else mastered the whole board. The DIA papers describe impossible accelerations, abrupt directional changes, and energy signatures that don't align with any known propulsion method. Another document outlines studies on metamaterials, pieces allegedly recovered from unknown craft. These fragments had layered structures engineered at microscopic levels, far beyond anything humans could create at the time. Mitchell often said we underestimate just how advanced extraterrestrial engineering might be. Reading the DIA papers with that idea in mind changes everything. You start seeing hints that our government might have gotten hold of technology but didn't know how to replicate it. One of the files also mentions remote operational platforms. Researchers think this could refer to drones, not human drones, but something capable of long-term, energy-efficient observation. The curious thing is that the DIA papers describe motion patterns resembling unmanned probes rather than piloted ships. With modern satellites, upgraded imaging tools, and decades of geological study, the Moon looks very different than it did during the Apollo era. Today's orbiters capture details earlier missions never could, and what they're showing isn't helping NASA's barren and lifeless message. Some of the newest photos reveal the same anomalies Mitchell's generation quietly debated, only now they're sharper, clearer, and harder to dismiss. For example, newer high-resolution scans show geometric patterns in several regions that don't fit naturally with lunar erosion or impact behavior. These shapes aren't random. They're straight-lined, symmetrical, and clustered in ways that stand out even to non-experts. When compared to older Apollo photos, researchers noticed consistency. The same formations appeared decades earlier, but now there's no grainy blur to blame. These images don't prove the existence of structures, but they match Mitchell's claims in a way that's difficult to ignore. Then there's the geology. Some areas of the Moon look artificially smoothed, as if leveled or cleared. Scientists have explanations, lava flows, ancient cooling patterns, meteor impacts, but the texture doesn't always match the expected results. A few regions reflect light differently than surrounding areas, which raises questions about what lies beneath. These mismatched readings line up with older seismic data that Mitchell himself handled during Apollo 14. Back then, the strange readings were chalked up to the Moon's unique composition. Today, they look more like signatures of hollow sections or layered spaces. But the most controversial claims come from people who say the US recovered unknown materials during early missions. These whistleblowers don't have public documents to back their stories, but the technical descriptions they give are unusually consistent. They talk about alloys with impossible purity, fragments that behave oddly under heat, and surfaces that reflect in ways nothing on Earth does. Whether these claims are true or not, they echo the same timeline Mitchell described. One where discoveries were made early, classified quickly, and discussed only in private circles. Even modern scientists who avoid conspiracy talk quietly admit that the Moon behaves strangely. Its ring-like seismic response, its hollow-sounding impact echoes, and its mismatched density, distribution don't point to anything alien directly, but they do create enough mystery. In fact, when you line up Mitchell's final statements with what modern data reveals, the story starts to feel less like a theory and more like a puzzle that's missing only a few pieces.